2, 1. Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, at its core, corporate carbon offsets are a band-aid solution and do not address the root cause of the problem. Before I move on to my rebuttal and extension ideas, here are a few key points of framing we think are crucial to the round and also serve as indirect rebuttal. The first is, this is a prefers motion and value judgment debate about what is the best methodology to reduce overall carbon emissions, because both sides agree that the goal is to how we can best reverse the effects of climate change, given things I don't think I have to spend too much time about, right? Rising temperatures globally, rising sea levels, the polar ice caps continuing to melt, and our ozone layer continuing to be damaged, hurting some parts of the world. The secondly is, corporate carbon offsets, I believe, are at best net zero, making them band-aid, or at worst, an actual net negative. It's counterintuitive. It's one step back, two steps forward, and I reject the premise and assertion given by the previous speaker that, oh, it's gonna be the same on both sides. No, it's not. At best, on their side, it could be the same, but at worst, it's going to be more bad. More on that later in my substantive. It's basically like filling a bucket, but poking a hole at the bottom. Why is that the case? Firstly, developing countries like the US and Europe headquarter the largest multinational corporations that harm the environment. Examples of these include, but are not limited to, Unilever, P&G, Shell, ExxonMobil, Nestle, L'Oreal, given that they are the biggest contributor to pollution to waterways and landfills by virtue of their single-use plastics. But secondly, ironically enough, these countries, even if they have the biggest investment in green technology that do merit them corporate carbon offsets, are ultimately still struggling to be able to implement, regulate, and perpetuate these particular technology. Which is why the previous speaker gave us a very confused characterization and contradicted herself when she responded to my POI. She said that these things are expensive, then responded to my POI but saying they're cheaper, but taking them at their best, even if we pour a lot of money on it, and even if in the long run these things do become cheaper, I'm not necessarily sure how building and planting more trees and forests is actually related to the business model of being able to produce cars, or being able to drill mines and be able to harness resources. We think it's ultimately a red herring, ladies and gentlemen, and ultimately just an illusion of effectiveness. Furthermore, we think that they actually challenge to get funding on status quo already. Things like nuclear and solar and hydro energy, even in the first world, continue to be very expensive for reasons such as struggling to get regulatory frameworks and people to be able to adopt the definition of these particular things, and even pushback from regulators when they have this idea of regulatory capture, which we saw in the e-vehicles industry when they got a lot of pushback from traditional manufacturers like Ford and Chevron, etc. We think that if we were to argue about this effectiveness of corporate carbon credits, we think that ultimately they also have the money to be able to buy their way out of these particular things, buy more carbon credits, and ultimately justify them being more productive in the sake of profit and ultimately being able to help it. It's a guise, ladies and gentlemen. We shouldn't believe that. What is our counterfactual? Our counterfactual is, why is the direct reduction in corporate carbon emissions better? And we think that this looks like status quo, but more. Status quo on steroids. An increased fine and sanction for carbon emissions directly proportional to your contribution. Oftentimes, corporate carbon offsets are a scapegoat, ladies and gentlemen, to mask the industrialization that they're trying to do. They invest in a forest and plant some trees, but at the same time, they continue seizing the means of production and being able to use this for the spirit of industrialization in order to be able to be more productive, especially with the rise of inflation, where in a lot of countries post-pandemic have a lot of ground to cover to be able to make back what they have lost, and ultimately, that makes it harder. But before that, sure, POI.
So you raised Shell as an example, right? So How do you ensure that Shell, which produces so much carbon tax as a core business, can achieve compliance on your side of the world where you can impose an arbitrary standard on their carbon emissions?
Because in status quo, we're already giving them carbon taxes, and we rather increase those as opposed to relying on their altruism and benevolence to have to invest in green technology to get these corporate carbon offsets that I tell you. Things like, investing in e-vehicles or renewable energy or carbon credits, and maybe even like being able to like plant things and all these particular things. We don't think it's particularly in their interest to have to do that. But even if they were to do that, there are so many more regulatory gymnastics that you have to go through. So many risks involved in assuming that they're going to want to do it. As opposed to on our side where it's negative reinforcement from the get-go. If you do not comply, we're gonna fine you. Or heck, it's fine. You can continue harming the environment, but we're gonna be able to tax you more, which serves as a disincentive structure for you to do it because these corporations ultimately have to protect their margins. Ultimately on our side, we told you that why are corporate carbon offsets not as effective as direct reductions in corporate carbon emissions? And this happens in the long run. Why is that? Because things like CSR and ESG are super sexy, but oftentimes, guys, let's be real. This is for compliance. The same way I would argue that these corporate carbon offsets are a guise in the means of them to say, I've done my part in the environment, let me do more. For every forest that I build, for every e-vehicle that I purchase for my staff, what I do is that I'm gonna continue being able to offshore and be able to export things from third world countries and developing nations and be able to ultimately do more harm to the particular environment. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we think that this merely is an illusion of effectiveness, and ultimately, we rather tackle the root cause of the problem, which is them directly being able to influence it. We support negative reinforcement as opposed to the gymnastics that you have to go through when you have corporate carbon offsets because green tech is super expensive, hassle, and speculative at best. For all these reasons, opposition clash.